Hi, now that we've cut our wing core with a hot wire, we need to cut or drill 2 holes in the core. One to accept the wing tube socket. It's a fiberglass socket that we'll make a little bit later here. That socket will slide all the way in to accept the wing tube, which is just a 1-inch piece of aluminum tubing that you can buy at the hardware store. And that will accept and support that tube. The second hole is a smaller hole that we'll drill with a smaller homemade drill bit. And this one just happens to be a wing tube out of a 30cc airplane that was crashed. It's just a piece of 1/2-inch carbon fiber rod, and I have taken a Dremel and just cut some teeth in the end of it. Did the same thing with the larger aluminum tube. Both of them cut amazingly well through the foam. We will need to build a jig to hold our foam block still while we're running the drill bit through it. And again, this is super easy to do. This is just a couple of scrap pieces of MDF that I have put some bearing blocks on that are made out of scrap wood that I had laying around here in the shop. And they act as a bearing to hold the homemade drill bit. So one is here and the other one there, of course, and that holds the drill bit straight. And we turn the drill bit with any kind of drill that you want to use there. You could set up a more elaborate system with a motor drive and all of that, but I find that I can cut 10 or 12 wing sets pretty easy with this, and then I just pick it up and put it out of the way, and I probably won't use it for a week or two, or maybe even longer after that. So the most important thing about this is to make absolutely sure that your wing tube drill bit is perfectly parallel to the table surface or your platform surface. To do that, the best way I have found is to make these blocks out of one piece of wood, drill a hole all the way through it, and then slice that block in half and use a half on one side and a half on the other side. That way you know your holes are exactly the same distance off the tabletop. I did the same thing with the smaller one. The only reason I have 2 sets of blocks here is because I like to use a larger wing tube for this plane and a smaller hole for the Aileron servo wire. So I have attached a simple fence. It just happens to be a 2x4 here that holds the block or guides the block, foam core block in place while I drill the hole. And probably the second most important thing to do here is to make sure that this fence is exactly parallel to our homemade drill bit. Super easy to do. Just extend the drill bit all the way through and measure this distance here, measure this distance here, and make sure that they're exactly the same. Just make sure that this is running parallel with the drill bit. Otherwise, when you put your wing half together, your wings will make a V one way or the other. You don't want that. You want them to be perfectly straight there. So we're going to cut one here, and placement in the wing core is not that critical. It can be, probably an 1/8 inch higher than the center line, an 1/8 inch lower. It doesn't make any difference as long as both halves are exactly the same. So make sure that your up mark is up. And in this case, I use a 1/4-inch shim underneath the foam block just to make sure that I get just about in the center. Now see, I'm not exactly in the center there. I'll pull that out and show you here. Pretty darn close, but I'm sitting a little bit high of the center line. Doesn't make any difference at all, as long as our right wing half and our left wing half are exactly the same. And as long as you keep that orientation mark that we put on earlier facing up, it is going to be exactly the same. So we'll drill a hole, and I've got a mark here with a Sharpie on the homemade drill bit that tells me how far I've gone into the core. And I know when to stop. the plug actually stayed in the wing core that time. When I use the carbon fiber tube, the plug generally starts to clog the tube up after about 6 or 8 inches. That's not a problem because I just take a air hose and I've drilled a hole up here on this end, and I can blow that out, and the whole plug will blow out, and then you can just start over. I drilled the same hole with the aluminum tube in anticipation of having to blow those plugs out, and oddly the foam doesn't get hung in the aluminum. I don't know why. Maybe just because it's a larger diameter. So how to get that plug out of our wing core? You can see here that the plug is left in there. So I take a wing tube, and again, this is just a 1-inch aluminum tubing that you can find at any hardware store. I happen to get mine at one of the Ace hardware stores. I buy an 8-foot lengths. Run it all the way down in there as far as our hole is drilled. And this is just a piece of hardwood scrap that I've tapered the end on just to make it a little bit sharp on the end. And I'm just sliding that down inside the tube against the plug. You don't have to go all the way down, and then just twist it, and you can hear it pop off inside there. And then just pull that plug out. And there it is. That's not all of it, so we'll go down again. And that's our hole cut right there. See, the line on our drill bit is here. And there's the 2 pieces. So that's all of it. So there we go. That's how we drill those holes. Super easy to build the jig to do it with. Nothing at all to be intimidated by. You don't have to worry about getting these blocks the exact height that you want to. I found that I like to make them a little bit longer because it's super easy just to add shims underneath your block to or your wing core to bring it up to the level that you want. If you make these blocks too short, then you're stuck with using smaller blocks of foam. These happen to be 4-inch blocks. The blanks that I was using to start with are 4 inches long. I have used, or 4 inches thick. I have used 3-inch, which gives us a little less meat down here on the bottom of the cull. I like the 4-inch thickness. It is a little more wasteful, but you know, you're only talking about probably 20 or 30 cents per difference between a 3-inch and a 4-inch block of this size. I like it. Just adds a little more stability in the vacuum bag, and it's easier to deal with. Now I've got the wing core shimmed up to the right height. I've moved the fence over just a little bit to allow the drill bit, the homemade drill bit, to move to where we want it. And sandbags back on. Like I said, it doesn't take long to feel some resistance with the carbon fiber tube. And that plug is hung in the end there. You could hear it pop out. sometimes it goes further than others. So now we've got both of the holes drilled that we need for the wing tube socket and the Aileron servo lead. This wing tube hole for the socket needs to be wallowed out just a little bit. And the first time that you put this socket in, it's awfully tight. But you can work it back and forth a few times and kind of turn it, and it enlarges the foam hole real easy. There we go. Get it where it slides in real easy. That gives you just a littlest bit of movement, both back and forth and up and down, and that way when we epoxy it together, the two pieces can set exactly where they need to be. So after we drill the holes, we want to make sure, just double check before we go to the trouble of sheeting these wings. Double check that our holes are in fact straight as we want them to be. So just take two pieces of two of the wings, the right and the left obviously, and put them together, and they are fitting perfect. We set them on a flat surface. They are the same height. The two holes are the same height, and if we look from one end to the other, it's a good straight line, no gap in here that would indicate that our holes are drilled at an angle. So everything looks good. I would recommend double checking before we go to the trouble. I have inadvertently put some dihedral in a wing half before. Didn't notice it until it was sheeted and actually finished and put on the plane, and noticed that the plane had some dihedral in it. I didn't really want it to. It flew great, but I didn't want the dihedral. So good idea to double check or triple check before you go any further from this point. If you do happen to have an alignment issue, when we put these sockets in, if you notice, this one slides real easily into that wing core. And the reason is I have worked it back and forth a good bit, and the roughness of the fiberglass actually acts like sandpaper and helps sand that hole out a little bit. And that's a good thing. You would think that you would want it as tight as possible, but you want just a littlest bit of play one way or the other, so that this tube can shift. Because when we glue it in with epoxy later, we will glue the two halves, we'll glue the sockets in with the two halves mated up, just like we had them a minute ago, and lock everything down on a nice flat table, and everything's super straight while the epoxy sets. That way we are ensured that the wing tube's going in perfect, and that it gets locked in place like it needs to be. We've drilled the hole for the wing tube socket, and it slides in nice and easy. So now we need to put the false rib in, and the false rib is just a piece of light ply that helps distribute the load on the end of this wing tube. It's a little bit tight for that one to fit in because I use a 1-inch hole saw, and obviously this is going to be a little bit bigger than 1 inch now. So I just use my Dremel sander, just a couple of passes around nice and lightly. Doesn't take much at all. And there we go, it slides in very nicely. So we're going to cut a slot there for that wing, that false rib to sit, and the wing socket will protrude the other side of that, probably, I don't know, 1 inch or so, and sit right there. So what we'll use to cut that is a Dremel with a plunge router adapter on it. This was one of the nicest things that I have ever run across, to be as cheap as it is. It's about 25 bucks, maybe just a couple of dollars more. I don't know, it depends on how you catch it on Amazon. That's where I got it. And it turns your router or your Dremel into a plunge router. And it's great for applications like this, and we'll use it several times throughout this project. So we have the area located that we're going to put this false rib, and on this particular wing it happens to be at 14 inches. And the reason it is at 14 inches is because that is where, or that is between two of the lightening holes that we'll put in the rib, excuse me, in the wing later on. So this is ultimately what the wing will end up looking like. It's got these lightning holes, and that false rib will end up sitting between these lightning holes there, so you won't see it. So 14 inches puts us right between two of those lightning holes, and we'll make our cut. And I've just made a rough outline. This is actually for another wing core. It's not even the same shape, but it serves our purpose to ride up against the little fence for the Dremel. And you just get it semi-straight. And I like to do the cut in two passes. One's about, I don't know, 3/4 of an inch deep, ½ inch deep, doesn't really matter, to make that first initial pass, and then I'll plunge it all the way down to make the final pass. Once I get it in the right location, I do like to tape this down. Just because you don't want it moving back and forth. If it's able to vibrate from one side to the other, or shift underneath your grip there, it just makes the slot wider. Again, it's not the end of the world. You can certainly fill it with epoxy and micro balloons, but it's just as easy to put, or it's much easier just to put a couple pieces of tape to help you hold it in place. There we go, so it's pretty stable. Get it set down. I'll use the vacuum to keep the styro gnats down. Okay, so to make this false rib, all I've done is taken a piece of 1/8 light ply and cut it on the bandsaw, and then we'll sand it to shape in just a minute. And we want to cover this area here. All we want to do is really cover this hole, catch a little bit of meat back here, a little bit of meat back here. We really don't even need to cover all of that hole. As a matter of fact, you can see from this one that I've marked already, it doesn't cover that entire hole up here where the servo lead goes through. It doesn't make any difference because it doesn't capture anything, doesn't hold anything up there. We just want an access so that the line can go through. So I have cut a piece that will fit in there nicely. It will come underneath just about to the top of the foam here. It doesn't matter if it sits even, but we don't want it to sit above that foam, and give us a little bit of meat on the bottom. It's all right if it goes all the way down and even with bottom. Obviously it can't protrude past, because then it'll interfere with the balsa. So as long as it sits in there about like that. We do want to cover this hole, and we want to make sure we catch some meat here, catch some meat up there, so that that thing can glue in up here. So I've cut it to rough size on the bandsaw. We'll slip it down in there and jiggle it around to make sure that it fits in good. And it's a little bit high. See how I'm grabbing it right there? So we'll take the sanding block with some coarse sandpaper on it. It doesn't take much at all. And a little bit more off the top. And I'm keeping that contour just a little bit round because remember we're curved on top of the wing here. Oh, and that's very nice. That's nice and smooth across there. So the next question is how to mark the hole, because we need to drill that hole. That's very easy to do, and what we'll do is set our piece down in there, get it settled in where we think it needs to fit, and take one of our wing tube sockets and take a Sharpie and just put you a little bit of ink on the end of the wing tube here. Doesn't take a whole lot, just like one time around real good, and then slide it in the hole here while you hold that piece in place. And of course now it's budding out on the bottom of it, and spin it. And that should be enough. And there we are. That's where our hole needs to be. So while we have the Sharpie, this mark forward and this mark up, so that we don't get confused later on, because we will. And all we'll do is go over to the drill press or hand drill, whatever you happen to have, and you don't have to be in the exact center of that hole, because remember we've got some leeway here, right? So just kind of judge the very center of that hole. Looks like it's going to be about right there. And we'll go over to the drill press and drill that hole out right there with a 1-inch hole saw. You can use a hole saw, spade bit, whatever you have. Just cut that thing out to 1 inch. And then of course that's going to be just a little bit small, because 1 inch is the size of our tube, and this is obviously thicker than the tube, bigger around than the tube, so it won't fit through our 1-inch hole. And like we saw earlier, or a little bit later, depending on how I organize those clips, just take the Dremel and 1 or 2 circles around with a sanding disc, and it will get it to the right size. Word of caution, don't sand too much. I have been tempted in the past to, or fallen to temptation in the past, and sanded too much, and it got too wobbly on me back there. So go maybe one time around, check it. If that's not enough, then go again. So this one is this was a little on the loose side, but it'll be all right. I prefer these to be kind of snug. So nothing to making that, and we will do the exact same thing for the next hole. Of course, we'll cut our hole and then lock our piece into place. Now that we're locked into place and it's where it needs to be, we'll just put our drill bit down there, spin it a few times, and it may have made a sufficient mark on it. If it didn't, we can handle that. Yeah, there we go. Probably can't see it from the camera, but that is the outline of where that hole is drilled. So a couple of ways we can do it. We can either cut it down with a Dremel, and that's certainly good enough. We're not going to be sliding a tube through there. That's just enough access for the servo lead to run through later. So unlike this hole, this one doesn't have to be anywhere near exact. Just enough for that servo lead to sneak through. slide back just a bit. That looks good. There we go. So the fit is good. We've got our front hole drilled out for the servo lead. And when I look down there, it's actually upside down. So we'll slide it back in. That looks good. Perfect. You see right down through the hole good. I know that you can't, but it's a straight shot right through. So now we'll take our 5-minute epoxy, which the two little puddles have not met each other yet. Mix up just a little bit more. And we're going to use a lot of micro balloons. I use a lot of micro balloon filler. This one happens to be Top Flight. It works great. We wouldn't want to use enough epoxy to hold that into place, just pure epoxy, because it would be way too heavy. If you haven't used these micro balloons yet, they are incredible. They take up a lot of volume. Of course, it will weaken the glue joint just a little bit, but in this particular case, it doesn't make any difference because we need very little adhesion, mechanical adhesion between that wood and the foam. Obviously, the glue joint could be very strong, but then just a couple of millimeters away, you're dealing with foam. So when you're gluing something to foam, the strength of the glue really doesn't matter, as long as it's stronger than the foam. I like to use the dust collector here to mix this stuff over. There is a warning on the back of this bottle. I think it's it contains soda, lime, something kind of glass, and that's not something you want to be breathing in. So when you're mixing this stuff up, it is so light that the dust from it will actually start floating through the air. So make sure you're using some good ventilation when you initially start mixing this until it gets all wet, and then obviously it's not going to be flying around then. Just don't breathe this stuff in, because it is glass. I think it's little glass balloons. Now we have increased the volume of that little bit of epoxy tremendously, and it is just super light. This stuff works great as filler and to increase the volume of the epoxy when strength is not needed. And I'm going to go ahead and put a mark up on that so that I don't accidentally turn it over again. I'm going to put a good bit on here because the stuff is so light that we can really spread it on here liberally. Ordinarily with epoxy we wouldn't dare put this much on here, but we want to close that gap up. It's a nice tight fit. If you tape the fence down and hold it nice and steady and then run that little router right up against the fence, it cuts a very nice slot that's just barely over an 1/8 inch. And it's worth taking the time to tape it down and hold it in position good to get a nice thin slot. If it does wallow around, it's not that big a deal. You can fill it with epoxy and micro balloons. And I try to stay away from the inside part of the hole because that's where the tube, socket tube is going to fit. And we're obviously going to have the tube in place while this epoxy sets to locate this in the right position while the epoxy sets. But we don't want to glue the tube in because the tube needs to come back out until we get ready to glue the tube in completely. So that looks pretty good. We've got the arrow pointing up. Slide it in. And I just take the excess epoxy because it is so light and just use it to help fill the gap. that is left behind at the top. Again, if this were straight epoxy, I wouldn't dare use this much epoxy. So there we are. And we will double check to make sure that we're in the right position. It is, it slid all the way in nice and tight. And I don't see any epoxy on the tube, so that's a good thing. So we're gonna slide it in there and so that it sits in the right position, just to make sure that that false rib doesn't shift while that epoxy sets. We'll set that one to the side and do another one. So this is a really good spot to end episode 5. Don't forget to hit like and to subscribe if you haven't already, and to share the video. That will get the YouTube algorithm to move us up in the ranking a little bit, and of course increase viewership, which won't hurt things at all. So I will see you in episode 6, where we glue these wing tubes in and make sure that everything's absolutely straight. So I will see you in episode 6.